let's get into the details of Uvalde a little bit here.
Sure.
Now that we've gone over sort of the general idea of active shooter training and what you're supposed to do in these sorts of situations. But what we saw in Uvalde, I mean, there's a number of things to talk about that, and we can get to some of these later on, like maybe if we have time, the police response time. I guess he was reported to have crashed into that ditch and then was shooting at people outside the school for like 12 minutes before he even went inside. But once he was inside, apparently two officers, local PD officers, did go in and try to confront him and were subsequently shot and had minor injuries as far as we're aware. But they disengaged at that point, and then backup started to arrive from basically every law enforcement agency within, however many miles of the situation, which is common for these things, right? That's what you're supposed to do. Everybody's supposed to go as fast as they possibly can and get there and intervene. But for some reason, a decision was made not to intervene. And instead, they cordoned off the area, created a perimeter to keep parents away while they tried to evacuate students who weren't inside the classroom that the shooter was in. And then they waited, over an hour before they finally went inside that classroom. And so, it certainly seems to contradict literally everything that you're taught to do in an active shooter situation, right? Is that how you feel?
Yeah, it really is. It looked like Columbine Part 2, only worse, with trying to evacuate people when the threat is active is not really, if on the way to the threat, you can tell the kids, hey, beat it, scram down that hallway, get out of here, that's great. But evacuations are generally ineffective, especially if the person's, I think at that point he was confined to a room and there were 911 calls coming in from that room and the room next door. Is that right? I think
that's correct.
Kids were calling in, so they knew what room he was in.
Kids called repeatedly, in fact.
Yeah, and I can't imagine what obstacle it was that prevented them from just going into that room.
The door was locked. That's all we've heard so far.
Right.
I don't know. Does that, I suppose maybe this was some of these schools in Texas have had this kind of hardening previously. Maybe this was a very specialized door to keep people out. I don't know. How difficult is it for law enforcement to breach even a high security door in your experience?
It depends. Generally speaking, patrol officers are not going to have breaching weapons, rams or stuff like that. Frequently, a supervisor will have that, sergeant or someone will have that in their trunk, and that can be available in the event that you need to breach a door. Let's say you have an impromptu search warrant or whatever. A more likely scenario is something like that. I don't know. I would really want to know before I comment whether it was some sort of very high security door or something like that.
Sure.
There had to be another way to get in there. And if that's the case, that the school hardened this room to the point where the police can't even get in, that's another training point, another prep point that we need to discuss and figure out. Because if that's the case, then that needs to change as well. I hope they're looking at that.
Yeah, I haven't heard any reports of them attempting to get through that door until a key was provided. So it's not clear to me exactly how much of an obstacle that door was.
Well, it depends on a number of things. First of all, does the door open in or out? Is it so if you're in the hallway, does the door pull out towards you or does it push in towards the classroom? If it pulls out, that does present some issues. If it pulls out, possibly getting the hinges off was an option. I don't know. And again, I feel like I'm commenting on something I can't really know.
Sure.
I can't really know what they were facing as opposed to the door, but man, go through the ceiling, go through a window, do something, anything other than, not getting in there as quickly as possible.
I think that there's even in a best case scenario in terms of like the door being very difficult to penetrate, it still seems, from what we know now, at least, and maybe we'll learn more, that there isn't much sense to the idea that they couldn't have at least attempted to go through that door before getting the key that was needed. But I wanted to also talk a little bit about this decision-making process, right? So the reason that's been given for why they didn't attempt to go in during this period after the first two police officers exchanged fire with the shooter is that he was considered to be barricaded inside of that room. I mean, what I guess maybe talk a little bit about that decision-making process for police officers, like how is it ever really appropriate to make that switch from active shooter to barricaded suspect or hostage holder, and what would be the factors that would make a responding, chief of police decide to switch there?
Well, I don't know. Again, there's a lot we don't know about the actual situation there on the ground at the time. But if there is shooting going on, and I think you and I discussed this on my show, there during these 911 calls, you could hear active shooting in the background.
Correct.
So if that's the case, there's no reason to hold or consider a barricaded subject. Barricaded subject, as far as I'm concerned, is somebody with no victims handy around him. No one to bargain with. So a barricaded subject is a guy in a house who ran from the cops, and now he's holed up in the linen closet with an AR or something like that. That's a barricaded subject. Somebody who has people that he's actively killing, he's just an active shooter. There's no such thing as in my mind, a barricaded subject. Now, maybe if he had started communicating with them somehow and said, I'm going to stop. I mean, I guess maybe, but I just don't see in this case, that wasn't the case even remotely. So I don't understand why anyone would decide to stop and hold at that point, because nothing has really effectively changed. I don't know if he ever stopped shooting at any point, but even if he stopped shooting, there's still kids in there. You're almost certainly bleeding to death. So the urgency doesn't really end just because he stopped shooting. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's one of my main points one of my main concerns when I think about this idea of him switching from an active shooter to a barricaded subject. The problem is that he was barricaded inside a classroom with a bunch of children who he'd already shot at the very least. I mean, there's no possible way that they could have known you still go in because those kids are bleeding. Most likely, there's no way they could know that they were already dead or that they weren't being shot. And then, in fact, he shot another child as the police breached. So, clearly there were still kids alive. So there was a report that one of the children did bleed out during this time period. And so it's just, even in a chaotic situation like that, even in a situation that none of us would want to ever have to confront ourselves, it just seems inexplicable, the decisions that were made. And I guess one thing, and you kind of touched on this earlier, but one thing I tried to focus personally on the leadership decisions that were made. There's I believe his name is Pete Arredondo, who's the supposedly the one who was making these decisions on the scene. But at the same time, you do start to wonder, why did every law enforcement official who showed up go along with these decisions that were made? I don't know. Can you give any insight into that?
Yeah,
maybe some of them were showing up after they declared him a barricaded subject, and I don't know. What do you?
Yeah, almost certainly that was the case. Almost certainly there was people coming in from far afield that didn't get there until maybe 30. I'm speculating, 30 minutes, 45 minutes after this whole thing had started. Because, like you said earlier, it's kind of like when there's a officer down, they say you send the world, you send every available unit. Same thing for an active shooter, especially at a school. So there was probably people coming in from all over the area, sheriff's deputies, in this case, Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol agents who were with
U.S. Marshals. Yeah,
the Border Patrol agents that actually went in were from BORTAC, which is the Border Patrol's version of a SWAT team, and they are very, very highly trained. I talk about that on this week's Ask podcast. I talked to a federal agent who's on a different SWAT team, but he sang their praises. They're very highly trained. Their mission is very specific. Those guys, they'll climb aboard a Black Hawk helicopter and be dropped on a ridge somewhere where there's a lookout or a guy with a rifle doing overwatch for cartel loads. It's really high speed stuff. So more to your point, why didn't anyone disobey that order? Yeah, that's an excellent question. You know, as a law enforcement officer, your duty is to the people you serve. Your duty is to the community that you serve. And if your chief, your sergeant, captain, lieutenant, whatever, is giving you an order that you consider to be immoral or unlawful, you're good to go to disobey that order. If you're willing to go in and get shot to save these kids, you're certainly willing to get disciplined or even lose your job if that's the case, behind your decision to disregard an immoral, unlawful order. I don't understand the decision makers' reasoning for what they did, but you know, a couple minutes after he says we're going to hold and try to evacuate people, I'm going to grab a couple of guys and go. And I think that's what the vast majority of officers would do. I don't know anything about their training. I know you've looked into their active shooter training. You said they had active shooter training a couple months ago, so who knows?